What if the real reason you feel angry isn't what happened, but something you didn't notice happening inside you? Picture a simple moment. Someone dismisses your effort, interrupts you, or treats you with quiet disrespect. The moment passes quickly, but something inside refuses to settle. Your mood shifts. Patience disappears. The rest of the day begins to feel heavier than it should. The strange part is that this happens to people everywhere, every day. A small event suddenly shapes the hours that follow. Yet not everyone reacts the same way. Some people walk away untouched, almost as if the situation had no power over them at all. That difference raises an uncomfortable question. If the event is the same, where does the anger really come from? Most people never stop long enough to investigate this. They assume the answer is obvious: someone else caused it, the situation caused it, life caused it. But that explanation leaves something important unexplained. If anger truly came from the outside world, then everyone would be controlled by the same moments in the same way. But reality shows something different. Certain people seem almost immune to situations that easily provoke others. They remain steady, while everything around them becomes emotional and chaotic. This contrast reveals a hidden possibility that most people overlook. The power of anger may not exist in the event itself, but in the invisible moment that follows it. The moment when the mind decides how important that event truly is. And once that decision is made, the emotion begins to take shape. Most people experience this process without ever noticing it. They simply feel the anger and assume it appeared on its own. But centuries ago, a group of thinkers became deeply interested in this exact mystery. Instead of trying to eliminate anger, they tried to understand why some minds seemed almost impossible to provoke. And the answer they uncovered about anger was so unsettling that once you truly see it, the emotion that once controlled you begins to lose its authority completely. Anger often arrives with a powerful feeling of certainty. In the moment it seems obvious that a response is necessary, a remark must be answered, a disrespect must be corrected, a point must be proven. The reaction feels justified, almost automatic. But watch closely what usually happens next. A moment that could have ended quietly begins to grow heavier. Words multiply. Tension spreads. What started as something small suddenly occupies far more of your attention than it deserves. This is the strange nature of anger. It rarely ends the conflict that created it. Instead, it keeps the conflict alive. Yet hidden inside every situation like this is a moment most people overlook. Between the event and the reaction, there is always a brief pause, a small space where the mind decides what meaning the situation will carry. Most people rush past this moment without realizing it exists. The reaction appears instantly, and the emotion follows wherever it leads. But the few who learn to notice that pause begin to see something surprising. Many things that once seemed important lose their urgency when they are not answered immediately. A careless comment fades. A disagreement dissolves. Even an insult often loses its weight when it fails to provoke a reaction. What once looked like a personal attack begins to appear smaller, almost temporary. This realization slowly changes how the mind views conflict. Not every moment requires a response, and not every challenge deserves your peace. Yet anger tries to convince you otherwise. It insists that silence is weakness and restraint is surrender. That is the illusion it creates. The mind begins to believe that reacting instantly protects its dignity. But the truth is far more unsettling. The faster the reaction, the easier it becomes for anyone to influence your emotions. And this is exactly the weakness the Stoics learned to eliminate by mastering one simple moment that most people never even notice. There is a moment that quietly decides whether anger will control you or not the moment someone tries to provoke you. It may be a dismissive comment, a challenge to your pride, or a small act of disrespect meant to get a reaction. Most people respond instantly. The mind moves fast, searching for the perfect reply, the sharpest comeback, the quickest way to defend itself. In that instant, the situation begins to grow larger than it truly is. A few careless words suddenly feel like a personal battle. But what if the real trap was never the insult itself, but the reaction it tries to trigger? Provocation only works when it receives the response it expects. Without that response, The moment begins to lose its weight. The tension fades. What looked like a confrontation slowly turns into something small and temporary. This is why the strongest form of control rarely looks dramatic. It often appears as restraint, the ability to pause, observe the emotion, and allow the moment to pass without turning it into something larger. Yet anger resists this approach. It creates urgency. It insists that silence means weakness and that dignity requires an immediate answer. That urgency is where many people lose themselves. The faster the reaction, the easier it becomes for others to influence your emotions. A careless person can shape your mood for the rest of the day simply by provoking the right response. But once you begin to see this pattern clearly, something important changes. The insult stops looking like a challenge you must answer. Instead, it becomes a choice you are free to ignore. And the moment you truly realize that ignoring certain provocations is not weakness but mastery, anger begins to lose the control it once had over your mind. Anger often appears suddenly, as if it were created by the moment itself. A comment feels insulting, a situation feels unfair, a plan collapses without warning. In those seconds, the emotion rises quickly, convincing you that the cause is obvious. Yet if you pause for a moment, another possibility begins to appear. The anger may not be coming from the event at all, but from the gap between what happened and what you believed should have happened. Reality moved one way, your expectations moved another, and the tension between them ignited the reaction. This is why two people can experience the same situation, yet respond in completely different ways. One sees an inconvenience and moves on. The other sees a personal offense that must be answered. The difference is not the moment itself, but the meaning the mind attaches to it. And once that meaning is accepted, the mind begins protecting it. A passing frustration becomes something worth remembering. The more attention it receives, the more significant it appears. Soon, the mind is not reacting to the original event anymore, but to the story it has built around it. This is how small moments quietly turn into lasting resentments. Yet there is a turning point hidden inside this pattern. The moment you question the story, instead of defending it, the emotion begins to weaken. The situation loses the certainty it once had. What seemed like an obvious insult starts to look less absolute, less permanent. And when that shift happens, you begin to realize something unsettling. Anger was never protecting you. It was protecting the expectations you refused to let go of. Anger has a strange effect on the mind. It convinces you that you are seeing things clearly, when, in reality, your vision has already narrowed. In those moments, everything seems obvious. Who is wrong, what must be said, how the situation should be answered. Yet that certainty is often the first warning sign that emotion has taken control. When anger rises, the mind begins to move faster than the situation itself. Decisions appear urgent, words feel necessary, reactions seem unavoidable. But urgency is exactly what anger relies on. The faster you respond, the easier it becomes for the emotion to guide the outcome. This is why some of the wisest thinkers practiced a different approach. Instead of reacting immediately, they changed their point of view. They stepped back from the moment and looked at it from another angle. Sometimes the insult they thought they heard was simply frustration from someone else. Sometimes the offense was nothing more than misunderstanding. And sometimes, the situation that felt important in the moment revealed itself as something that would disappear if left alone. This shift in perspective quietly weakens anger because the emotion depends on certainty. Once doubt enters the picture, the intensity begins to fade. What looked like a battle begins to look temporary. What felt personal begins to look smaller. Yet anger resists this shift. It pushes the mind to act before clarity returns. Many people follow that impulse and only later realize the cost of decisions made in rage. And when you finally see how quickly anger tries to rush your judgment, you begin to understand something powerful. The strongest mind is not the one that reacts first, but the one that refuses to be rushed at all. Most people think anger is caused by what others do to them. An insult, a mistake, a moment of disrespect, and suddenly the emotion appears. It feels automatic, almost unavoidable. But something strange happens when you look closely. The exact same situation can happen to two different people. One explodes with anger, the other simply moves on. The moment didn't change. So what did? What changes is the story the mind builds in that instant. Within seconds, the brain turns a small event into something personal, something urgent, something that must be answered. And the faster the mind moves, the stronger the emotion becomes. That speed is where anger gains its power. Because once the reaction begins, the emotion starts steering everything. Your words, your tone, your decisions. In that moment, it feels like control. But later, many people realize something uncomfortable. The reaction they thought would solve the problem only made the moment heavier. That is why some ancient thinkers described anger in a very unusual way. Not as strength, not even as emotion, but as a brief loss of clarity. When it appears, the mind narrows. The situation feels bigger than it actually is, and the urge to react feels stronger than the urge to understand. But there is one moment, a small, almost invisible moment, where everything can change. Most people rush past it, but those who notice it discover something powerful. Because the moment you refuse to react instantly, the anger that once felt overwhelming suddenly has nowhere left to go. There is a quiet moment that most people never notice. It happens right before anger fully takes over. At first, it is only a spark, a sudden rush of heat, a tightening in the chest, a quick urge to respond. In that instant, the mind begins preparing for conflict. Words form, judgments appear. The body moves toward reaction. Most people follow that impulse immediately. And once the reaction begins, the moment starts controlling them. But the ancient Stoics trained themselves to notice that tiny space before the reaction. Not the anger itself, but the instant when the mind decides what to do with it. Because that is where real power exists. When a person becomes aware of that moment, the situation begins to look different. The urge to react no longer feels automatic. The emotion that once felt unstoppable suddenly becomes something that can be observed. And once you can observe something, you are no longer completely controlled by it. This is why Stoic philosophers believe the strongest people were not the ones who never felt anger. They were the ones who refused to let it drive their actions. While others rushed into arguments, they remained steady. While others allowed frustration to dictate their words, they chose silence, patience, or distance. Not because they were weak, but because they understood something most people never realize. The moment anger stops controlling your actions, it stops controlling your life. And once you reach that point, something remarkable happens. The emotion that once felt powerful becomes nothing more than a passing noise in the mind. Taoist thinkers also notice something unusual about anger. Most people believe the problem exists outside of them, another person, a mistake, a situation that went wrong. But Taoist teachers often ask a quieter question: what is happening inside you at that moment? Because when the mind becomes noisy, every small disturbance feels larger than it really is. Thoughts multiply, judgments appear. The mind begins searching for something to blame. In that state, even a small irritation can quickly grow into anger. But Taoist wisdom places great importance on something very simple: inner stillness. When the mind becomes quiet, many reactions lose their urgency. Situations that once demanded a response suddenly look less important. The mind no longer rushes to defend itself or prove something to others. Instead, it begins to observe. And observation changes everything. A person who can step back and watch their own thoughts begins to notice how quickly emotions rise and fall. Anger that once felt overwhelming now appears more like a passing storm, loud for a moment, but temporary. Most people never discover this because their attention is always outside of them. But those who turn their awareness inward start to see a deeper truth. The calmer your inner world becomes, the less power the outer world has to provoke you. There is an old story about a skilled player that reveals something important about the mind. When small pieces of glass were placed on the line, he played effortlessly. His hands moved naturally. His focus was clear. nothing disturbed him. Then, the stakes changed. A valuable belt buckle was placed on the line. His movements became tighter. The task that once felt easy began to feel heavier. Finally, money was placed on the line. This time, he failed completely. Not because his skill had disappeared, but because the moment suddenly felt too important. Once the mind becomes trapped by what might be gained or lost, something inside begins to change. The calm that once guided every movement quietly disappears, and the situation starts controlling the person instead. This is where anger often begins. When pride, reputation, or victory feels threatened, the mind reacts as if something must be defended immediately. The emotion rises quickly, pushing for a reaction before clarity has time to return. And in that state, even small situations can turn into unnecessary battles. Most people believe anger helps them take control of the moment. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Because the moment anger enters the mind, it is no longer you who is in control of the situation. Many people believe anger appears because something unfair happens. But often, something else is hiding behind it. The need to prove something. In everyday life, this happens quietly. A disagreement turns into a debate. A debate slowly becomes a fight. Not because the issue is important, but because neither side wants to step back. The mind begins defending pride. And once pride enters the situation, the conflict grows far beyond the original moment. Ancient philosophers noticed this pattern everywhere. They observed that people rarely argue to discover the truth. Most arguments exist for a different reason. To win, to protect their image, to avoid feeling small. And anger becomes the fuel that keeps that battle alive. But the person who truly understands life begins to see the trap. They notice how many conflicts are not about justice or truth at all, only about ego. Once that becomes clear, something changes. The urge to prove yourself starts losing its importance. The argument that once felt necessary suddenly looks pointless. And the energy that once fed anger begins to disappear. Because the moment you stop trying to prove yourself to everyone, most of the anger in your life quietly disappears with it. There is a strange reason people return to anger again and again. Not because it solves problems, but because it feels intense. In the moment, anger creates a rush. The heart beats faster, words come quickly, the mind feels sharp and alert, as if something important is happening. That surge of emotion can feel strangely satisfying. And that is where the trap begins. Because the feeling is powerful, the mind starts believing the reaction is necessary. The conflict grows louder, the conversation becomes harsher, and the moment keeps escalating. But after the emotion fades, the situation usually looks very different. The argument solved nothing. The tension remained. Sometimes, it even created a bigger problem than the one that started it. This is why some thinkers described anger as something dangerous to rely on. The mind begins chasing the emotional intensity instead of the solution. And once that happens, the real issue quietly disappears behind the conflict itself. But when a person begins noticing this pattern, something changes. Instead of feeding the emotional storm, they start asking a different question. What actually needs to be solved here? That small shift pulls attention away from the fight and back toward the problem. And once your mind stops chasing the emotion of anger, the conflict in front of you suddenly becomes much easier to resolve. Most mistakes in life are not made slowly. They happen in seconds. A message arrives with the wrong tone. Someone says something careless. A plan suddenly collapses. In that brief moment before thinking clearly, the mind reacts with surprising speed. Emotion appears first. The body tightens. Words rush forward. The situation begins to feel larger than it actually is. A small moment starts pulling the mind into a much bigger conflict. And the strange part is how convincing that first reaction feels. It feels urgent. It feels justified. It feels like something that must be answered immediately. So people respond right away. A sharp reply, a harsh judgment, a decision made too quickly. Only later does the mind notice something uncomfortable. The situation itself was manageable. It was the reaction that turned it into something difficult. This is the moment disciplined thinkers begin to separate themselves from their first impulse. Instead of trusting the emotion that arrives instantly, they give the mind a little distance, just enough time for clarity to return. And when that clarity appears, the situation often looks very different from the way it first seemed, because the first reaction is rarely the wisest one. But the person who learns to pause before answering it begins gaining control over moments that control everyone else. There is a strange pattern people rarely notice about happiness. It often appears in the moments when expectations quietly disappear. Not during the times when everything is going according to plan, not when life feels perfectly organized, but after something slips, when a plan fails, when certainty fades, when the future suddenly becomes unclear. In those moments, the mind stops demanding so much from the world. For a brief time, it simply observes what is in front of it. Some people react to this loss of control with frustration. Every disruption feels like proof that life is moving in the wrong direction. But others respond differently. Instead of trying to force life back into the shape they expected, they loosen their grip on the outcome itself. And something unexpected happens. Without constant expectation pulling at every moment, ordinary things begin to feel lighter. Conversations feel easier. Small successes feel more meaningful. Even difficulties stop feeling like personal attacks. End of course. Tex and Godders of Godder. End of course. End of course. End of course. End of course. Tex and Godders of Godders. End of course. Tex and Godders of Godders. End of course. 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 Please let her now finish at organizingandpeck.com. Life has not become easier, but the struggle against it has quietly faded. And the moment you stop demanding that life match your expectations, you often discover that happiness was never as far away as it seemed. Many decisions in life are not really decisions. They are reflexes. A comment feels disrespectful. An accusation appears. A message carries the wrong tone. Before the mind has time to examine it, the fingers are already moving, the voice already rising, the reaction already forming. Why? Because the mind feels an urgent need to defend something: reputation, pride, the image we believe others should have of us. In those moments, it feels dangerous to stay silent. It feels like losing. So the response is sent. The argument begins. And a small moment suddenly becomes a conflict that lasts far longer than it needed to. But occasionally, a person interrupts this pattern. The message is written. The response is ready. For a second, the mind insists it must be sent. Then something rare happens. The person waits. Not because they are weak, but because they realize that the urge to respond is not coming from clarity, it is coming from wounded pride. And pride is one of the most expensive emotions to obey. Because the strongest form of self-control is not forcing yourself to act. It is recognizing the moment when doing nothing is the wiser move. Most people spend their entire lives studying others. Very few ever learn how to recognize the minds that quietly control the room. And that is exactly what the next video is about. If this video made you think differently about anger, discipline, and control, then Stoicism is where we keep exploring the psychology behind powerful minds. So subscribe and stay with us as we break down the ideas that help you stay calm while the world around you loses control. Now the video on your screen, 5 signs you're dealing with a truly dangerous mind, Stoicism. Some people don't look dangerous at all. They speak calmly. They appear intelligent. Sometimes they even seem kind. But once you understand the signs, you start noticing a pattern in how they think, how they influence others, and how they quietly take control of situations. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Click the video and see if you've ever met one.